Last weekend, nearly a year after the CDC implemented a national eviction moratorium, the order expired, leaving the millions of American renters who are behind on their rent more likely to face eviction. This issue, the eviction moratorium, is a really complicated and sensitive topic that impacts millions of Americans, both landlords and tenants alike. Today, we're going to take a holistic look at this issue to see how the COVID-19 crisis and the eviction ban that came from it are disrupting the American rental housing market, and we'll talk about what might happen next. I'm Dave Meyer. I'm the Vice President of Data and Analytics at BiggerPockets, and I want to thank you all for joining me today while we discuss this important news. Before we get into what's happening right now, let's recap the history of the eviction moratorium and where we stand today. As we all know, in early 2020, COVID-19 caused the economies around the world to shut down. And in the US, this led to a huge spike in unemployment, unlike anything we've seen before. Millions of people were losing their job every single week. That's never happened before. So among the many other actions the government took to limit the impact of this combined health and economic crisis, the CDC issued an eviction ban in September of 2020. Ever since, it has been a very controversial policy, to say the least, and let's look at why this is. In any rental arrangement, there are two parties. There are tenants and there are property owners or landlords. And each of these parties are impacted in essentially opposite ways by the moratorium. And I'll start by talking about the tenant situation. When the economic crisis began in early 2020, approximately 15% of Americans reportedly lost their jobs, according to Pew Research. For most of these people, the loss of employment was to no fault of their own, just an unfortunate impact of the pandemic. And of course, when people are out of work, it makes it difficult for them to meet their financial obligations, rent often being the biggest obligation of all. And if renters fall behind on rent, they can, of course, face eviction, which is a really unfortunate situation on many fronts. The most obvious impact is that the renter and their family lose their home, which can cause this cascade of problems. It becomes much harder to find a new apartment with an eviction on your record, and a lack of stable housing comes with many of its own challenges, like finding a job and getting back on your feet financially, just to name one example of many. So a single eviction can cause great hardship to a person or even a whole family. It's an awful situation that no tenant or landlord, I should mention, wants to find themselves in. Also, evictions at large scale can have huge impacts on the economy and society at large, which we're going to talk a bit more about later. But the main point here is that many people support the eviction moratorium because it helps renters and their families stay in their homes where they can hopefully get back on their feet financially and provide a safe and stable home for their families, which in my opinion at least is a very worthy goal. But on the other side of this equation, we have landlords. To this group, despite good intentions, the eviction ban is simply shifting the economic hardship of the pandemic from renters to property owners. This probably seems obvious, but landlords rely on rental income to meet their own financial obligations. Property owners have big expenses like a mortgage, taxes, insurance, and repairs, and when a renter does not pay rent, the landlord still has those expenses. They still have to fix the heat, to pay the mortgage, their taxes, and so on. This creates a really tough situation for the landlord because they aren't getting rent, and the one last resort options they typically have to recover income, which is evictions, is not available to them right now. So many landlords are then forced to pay expenses out of their own pocket, which can cause huge financial distress for the property owner and can even lead to foreclosures. Now, if you think all landlords are rich and can afford to take on that burden, I will remind you that approximately 40% of all rental properties in the United States are owned by so-called mom and pop investors. So when I am personally talking about landlords, I'm not talking about hedge funds and these massive corporations here. I'm talking about people who own one or maybe a few rental properties as investments. Often these investors rely solely on their rental income to live. So when renters don't pay, they may lose some or even their entire income. And while I truly believe that no landlord in their right mind wants to evict a tenant, many need that option as a last resort to preserve their own financial security. Like I said at the top of the show, it's a super complicated issue. The eviction moratorium seeks to, and has largely been successful at, protecting tenants from financial disaster. But at the same time, it puts another group of Americans, property owners, at the much greater financial risk. Now, this complicated issue was not entirely lost on the government, and stimulus bills passed by both the previous administration and the current one allocated billions of dollars in rental assistance. More than $46 billion to be more specific. The idea here is that direct payments to landlords would be a win-win for both landlords and tenants. It would give tenants the assistance they need to get back on their feet, and it would allow landlords to collect the rent they are legally owed and meet their own financial obligations. Okay, so that's the background of the situation, and that brings us to where we are today. The CDC created this order back in September of 2020, and it has been extending the moratorium for months. And most recently, it extended it until the end of July 2021. And the CDC may have wanted to continue extending this indefinitely, but the Supreme Court put an end to that last month. The issue came before the court, and it ruled 5-4 that the moratorium could stay in place till the end of July. However, really importantly, one of the justices who ruled actually in the majority, Justice Kavanaugh, stated that he would block further extensions of the moratorium without approval from Congress. Basically, this meant the moratorium is no longer in the CDC's hand and is now in the hands of Congress. And Congress let the bill lapse. There was discussion about an extension, but it did not come to pass. And as of August 1st, there were no federal protections against evictions. But that did not last long. I actually had to re-record this entire show because news dropped Tuesday afternoon that the CDC enacted a new evictions moratorium in areas affected by the Delta variant. Early estimates show that this new order will likely cover 90% of renters and will last until at least October 3rd. This order will almost certainly be challenged in court, but that could take a while. So for now, landlords who are seeking relief from non-paying tenants will likely have to wait, and tenants who are behind on rent have a bit more time to apply for federal relief, to recover financially, or to work out an arrangement with their landlords. But eventually, this is all going to come to a head, whether it's this week, in October, or sometime in the future. The federal moratorium has to come to an end, as do the various state and local protections that have also been put in place. What happens when the protections are lifted is unclear, but let's take a look at some of the numbers. According to the Department of Housing and Urban Development, 6.4 million American households are behind on their rent. And within those households, the Aspen Institute estimates about 15 million people owe around $20 billion to their landlords. And perhaps most startling of all, as of July 5th, roughly 3.6 million people said they faced eviction in the next 2 months, and that's according to the U.S. Census Bureau's Household Pulse Survey. It's unclear how many of these renters will be protected by the new federal ban or various other state or local protections, but regardless, the situation is pretty dire. Literally, millions of people feel they could be facing eviction in the next couple of months. And let me just reiterate that a wave of evictions of this scale would be a bad situation for pretty much everyone. Sure, landlords could evict non-paying tenants and look for new tenants to restore their income. But at the same time, it could increase vacancy rates, which will make finding replacement tenants difficult, and it could put downward pressure on rent prices. On the tenant side, a wave of evictions would obviously cause great hardship for those losing shelter and could send shockwaves through the entire system that hamper the economic recovery. So avoiding a wave of evictions, in my opinion, is still the best case scenario, and it's unclear if that wave of evictions will actually come. I mean, it certainly could. I am honestly a bit concerned about this, but there are a few reasons for optimism. First is the federal rental assistance programs we talked about earlier. Do you remember those $46 billion in assistance that was supposed to be distributed to renters and landlords? Well, according to the Treasury Department, only $3 billion has actually been distributed so far, which is a measly 7%. The way the rent relief system works is that the federal government distributes the money to states, who then distribute the money in their own way, and the states have been painfully slow to give out the money so far, but there are reports that the distribution is accelerating. So there is potential that a great deal of the total back rent owed by tenants can be paid by federal relief programs. There is nearly $42 billion out there to set aside to help renters and landlords in this exact situation. All we need is the states to hurry up and give it out. The second reason I have hope is jobs. We actually talked about this a few weeks ago when discussing a potential foreclosure crisis, and the same applies here. Currently, there are more open jobs than there are job seekers in the United States. And wages are also going up, with many traditionally lower paying companies having upped their minimum wage to $15 or even $18 per hour. And this strong employment environment should help more renters get back on their feet. These two things combined will hopefully make both sides whole. Federal relief programs can help landlords get back rent they are owed, and a strong employment environment should ensure renters can pay rent as agreed going forward. But all of this is super unclear still. States will need to dramatically accelerate aid. Landlords have the option whether or not they're going to accept that aid. And there are hundreds of other social and economic variables at play here that make this situation very murky. As this situation unfolds, I will certainly keep you all updated. And in the meantime, I hope everyone, both tenants and landlords alike, are safe, healthy, and recovering from this pandemic and economic crisis. Thank you all so much for joining me today to learn about this important issue. My name is Dave Meyer, and I'll see you all next week.